So I thought I would take a minute to use the sample synthesis essay on Atlantis to demonstrate exactly what we mean by proper MLA style in-text citation and works cited to properly credit your sources to avoid any hint of plagiarism. And this goes back to the page I shared earlier, which is the 3 golden rules of crediting sources, of avoiding plagiarism. Rule number 1 boils down to, if it didn't come out of your own head, cite it. What that means is any sentence or group of 2 or 3 sentences that contain information from a source rather than from your own head has to have an in-text citation at the end of the sentence or sentences crediting the source that the information came from. So, for example, if we're looking at the sample paper and scroll down to the first body paragraph, we see our first in-text citation, which is this one, Shermer 42. Basically, this one's pretty obvious. We have a quotation here. So our sentence says, the story of Atlantis first appeared in Plato's Timaeus and Critias in 360 BC. In these 2 dialogues, Plato describes a civilization that warred with Athens, after which, quote, there were violent earthquakes, and in a single day and night all sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared into the depths of the sea. Well, obviously, if you're quoting a source, it didn't come out of your own head. So at the end of that sentence, directly following the direct quote, we have an in-text citation in MLA format. An MLA format, a standard in-text citation, meaning the parenthetical citation that appears at the end of a sentence that contains information from a source, is usually the author's last name, and if it's a paginated source, the page number. You also see it in the following sentence, even though there's not a direct quote. And this is where it gets a little trickier because you have to be very careful whether you put a source in your own words, meaning you paraphrase it or you summarize it, or whether you directly quote it, you still need an in-text citation at the end of that sentence, or again, group of 2 or 3 sentences. So we have, according to Plato's account, Atlantis' destruction occurred approximately 9,000 to 11,000 years before his writing. The tale is told to him by Critias, who in turn heard it from his father, who heard it from his grandfather, who received the manuscript from an Athenian statesman who was given the information by Egyptian priests. All of that is in our author's own words, but it definitely didn't come out of our author's own head because it's very specific information. And so we still credit the source of that information, which in this case, the author's last name is Benetatos. So that's what goes in the in-text citation. Also, in this case, the source is an internet source, meaning it doesn't have page numbers. So there's no page number, and that's fine. And if we go down to our works cited list, way at the end of the paper, we'll see, hey, look, there's Benetatos. That's the source that sentence came from. And if I, as a reader, really, I think that sounds fascinating, I want to read that same article, or I want to make sure this author is fairly representing this article, the works cited entry is the full version of sort of the shortcut version in the in-text citation that tells us exactly where we can find that same source if we want to, and look at exactly what our author looked at when they researched. So we have the author's last name, or the author's full name, the title of the article, the website from which the article came, the date on which the article was published, the URL to go find that exact same article, and the date on which I accessed it. And using that information, my readers can go find the same Benetatos article that I read to get the information in that sentence. Similarly, we've got Shermer. Same idea. That article that we quoted in the first sentence of our first paragraph, or our first body paragraph, we've got author, his name, the title of his article, the publication in which it appeared, the volume number, the issue number, the year it was published, and in this case, the page on which it was published. And looking back up at our in-text citations, we see Shermer, author's last name, page number. Benetatos, no page number because it's not a paginated source. No problem. And again, we see Benetatos. Benetatos again. Here we see an author named Kuhn because it follows a direct quote. But here we have another sentence that doesn't have a direct quote, but the information is very specific, so it clearly came from a source. The Atlanteans became greedy and warlike, attacking Athens and other Mediterranean societies. This, says Plato, sealed their doom, as the gods punished them for their wickedness by condemning the island to the depths of the sea in a cataclysmic 24-hour period. Didn't quote Kuhn, but got the info from Kuhn, so there's still an in-text citation at the end of that sentence indicating that this information came from the source that if I want to know the full information about where to find that source, I just go down to my Works Cited page and I look for what was in that in-text citation, in this case, Kuhn, and there he is, and there's all the information I need to go find that source. So it seems very complicated, but once you work with it a little bit more and you understand the spirit of citation, it's not actually that complicated. Now, what happens if you have a source with no author? Because typically an MLA style works cited entry will start with the author, or if there's no author, but there is an organization that published the information, there might be the organization in place of an author. But sometimes you have neither. You don't know the specific person who wrote it, and there's not a specific organization backing it up. Well, when that happens, the works cited entry will then begin with the title of the source. So like this one, the title of the source is Atlantis. It didn't have an author, so Atlantis comes first. Whereas if it does have an author, the title comes second. Here's another one. There's no specific author, but the title of the source is The Best Bet for a Real Atlantis. Lost Continent Found. Scientist says Ireland is the lost island of Atlantis. So when basically your in-text citation will always include whatever comes first in your works cited list entry, because that helps your reader quickly figure out which works cited entry corresponds with that particular in-text citation. Again, usually the author's last name, Kuhn, Benetatos, etc. But if it's the title of the article, if we go back up and look at our in-text citations, we'll see eventually here, for example, this in-text citation just says scientist in quotation marks. And the reason why is because we go back down to our works cited list entries and we look, they're alphabetized, so we can look very quickly at the beginning of each works cited list entry. Oh, here's scientist. And you only need to use, even though the full title of the article is Scientist Says Ireland is Lost Island of Atlantis, you don't have to put that whole thing in there because a lengthy in-text citation disrupts the flow of your writing. So you don't want to have your in-text citation be almost a full sentence in itself. So in this case, this is our only source in our works cited list that starts with the word scientist. So our in-text citation, if I can find it again, only has to say scientist, because that's all it takes for us to recognize which works cited list entry that particular in-text citation matches. Same thing if we go up a little further, we see best bet. In this case, there's a page number following it because that is a source that has page numbers. Again, if it does not have page numbers, you don't need to include the page number. You just need to include the author or author's last names or the title of the source. Same thing here, lost continent. We can go down to our works cited list and very quickly identify which works cited list entry the in-text citation is talking about. Best bet, lost continent, scientist, or if there is an author, Shermer, Rincon, Kuhn, Christopher, Caesar, Benetasos. That is basically, that's what works cited means in MLA. It means these are the works I cited in my paper. So as long as you remember that works cited means, hey, this is what I cited, then you know that each in-text citation matches with a particular works cited list entry and vice versa. Now, our second golden rule. So our first golden rule of avoiding plagiarism is if it didn't come out of your own head, cite it. Any information that came from a source rather than something that you came up with yourself has to be credited with an in-text citation at the end of the sentence or small group of sentences that came from that source. And when in doubt, sort of the subset of that rule is if you're not sure whether you should cite it or not, cite it. Putting too many citations might be a little annoying. Putting too few citations is plagiarism. So when in doubt, cite. And if it didn't come out of your own head, cite it. And if you are not considered an expert in the field, but you kind of know something about it and you kind of remember, oh yeah, I read about Atlantis when I was 10 in that book and this is what it said, double check yourself, fact check yourself. You don't have enough built-in credibility for your readers to just believe very specific factual information that you put down. So you would want to double check that you're right and then go ahead and cite your fact check. But again, If it didn't come out of your own head, cite it. When in doubt, cite. Rule number 1. Rule number 2, if you use 3 or more words in a row directly from the source, meaning your words are exactly the source's words, then you must include that information in quotation marks to indicate basically not only did the facts or the information come from this source, the actual writing came from this source. So whether it's in your own words or in the words of your source, you still have to include a citation. But if you do use your source's exact words in what's known as a direct quote, you also have to use quotation marks to say, hey, not just the information, but also the writing came from this source. So, for example, this sentence here, it says, Plato was very fond of using parables to make a point, saying, quote, we may liken the false to the true for the purpose of moral instruction. I got that quote from Schirmer, so we're going to credit Schirmer. That quote is found on page 42, so we're putting that in the in-text citation as well. And we're using quotation marks around we may liken the false to the true for the purpose of moral instruction to indicate that not just that information, but the exact wording came from Schirmer. Now, one important thing to notice here is that Schirmer is quoting Plato there, but you will always credit where you got the information. So as the writer here, I didn't get that quote from Plato. Schirmer got it from Plato, but I got it from Schirmer. So I'm going to credit Schirmer always. And that 3 or more words in a row thing is just kind of a general rule of thumb. The real spirit of that rule is if you're going to paraphrase or summarize a quote, meaning you're going to take the information but put it in your own words, then make sure you change the writing enough that you can truly say, hey, this information came from my source, but the writing, the words are my own. Otherwise, just directly credit the source for both the writing and the information. And you don't want to overquote, so make sure you're mixing in paraphrasing and summarizing and not just having giant chunks of quote in your paper, because at that point your reader's like, well, why don't I just read your source? But if you do use your source's exact words, which is sometimes valuable to do, make sure you use quotation marks in addition to an in-text citation to credit that source. But remember, even if you put it in your own words, for example, this sentence, you still have to credit where you got that information. So Erlingson believes that the story of Dogger Shoal, well, shoot, that's a quote too, sorry. Let me find a different one. Here we go. Another recent theory places Atlantis at Santorini, a Greek island civilization buried in a volcano explosion some 3,500 years ago. However, the size, location, date, and details of the aftermath do not match up. There's no direct quote in there. All of that is the writer's own words. But that, again, is very specific information that didn't just come out of the writer's own head. So we still have to credit the source, in this case, the best bet for a real Atlantis, via an in-text citation. So rule number 1, if it didn't come out of your own head, cite it. Rule number 2, if you use the source's exact words, credit the source not just with the citation, but also with quotation marks. And then finally, the most important and trickiest rule is rule number 3, which says your in-text citations and your works cited have to clearly correspond exactly. And if you know that rule, you'll always be able to tell if you're doing it properly, because basically what it's saying is the whole point of in-text citation is to lead to your works cited list entry to lead you to the source. So, for example, here, I've got this sort of short in-text citation that just says lost continent and then 13, which is the page number. But what this does is it should lead me immediately, if I go down to my works cited list, I should see a works cited list entry that begins with the words lost continent. And when I go down, here it is. That's the corresponding works cited list entry that in-text citation was responding to, or matching to. And the works cited list entry gives me all of the information I need. Title of the article, publication in which it appeared, volume number, issue number, date it was published, and the page numbers of that periodical on which it appeared. And I can use that information and go find the exact same source that author was looking at if I want to. And that is the entire point of in-text citations and works cited. The in-text citation is short, so it doesn't disrupt your writing too much, but it leads to a specific works cited list entry, which leads to the exact same source that I looked at. And if you kind of keep that in mind, that's the most important thing. If you know when to cite and why you're citing, the actual formatting, what your citation should look like, what your works cited entry should look like, you can just look that up. There are style guides. I like the Purdue Owl because it's free, but there are style guides for MLA and APA and Chicago Manual of Style and AP Style and all of the different, frankly, nitpicky and annoying styles that we use to credit sources in different disciplines. But you just have to look up the style guide and look up what that works cited list entry should look like. And once you know what your works cited list entry should look like, then you know what your in-text citation should look like. So, for example, this works cited list entry, we've got an author, Kevin Christopher, and we've got page numbers. So we know our in-text citation is going to be the author's last name and then whichever page that appeared on. And if we go look, here we go. Here's an in-text citation that came from that source. Author's last name, the page number it appeared on. In this case, there's no author. So the first thing in our in-text or first thing in our works cited list entry will then be the article's title, which should start with the words lost continent. Sure enough, here it is, lost continent found. The other thing to note about proper citation and proper works cited, it's not just about avoiding plagiarism, crediting your sources, and not getting in trouble. It's also about making sure that you get credit for what are your own ideas, your own insights, your own experiences, your own argument. If we trust that the author has properly credited their sources throughout, then when we see something in the paper that doesn't have a citation, we know it came from the author themselves. So, for example, let's look down at this paper's conclusion. We've got from a paper that has been very careful to include in-text citations throughout the paper. We have things like, regardless of these compelling arguments against the existence of Atlantis anywhere outside of Plato's writing and the human imagination, scholars and adventurers still hold out a hope of one day finding the remains of the lost civilization or at least solid evidence of his existence. After all, is it so difficult to imagine millennia from now mankind recording the legend of New Orleans, the city built in arrogance below the sea that ultimately swallowed it? Or of California, the land that grew so decadent that God dropped it into the ocean? Sometimes myths and legends, when scratched deeply enough, reveal veins of historical truth. Other stories, once believed to be mere myths, have turned out to be based in fact, such as the Great Flood and the city of Troy. Why not Atlantis? All of that information, there's no citation in there. That means if we trust our author, that all of this came from our author's own head. These are their ideas. They did their research. They learned more about the story of Atlantis, the different theories, and the skepticism of those theories. And they came up with, for example, their own idea that, hey, it sounds crazy, but a few thousand years from now, maybe people will be talking about New Orleans and California the same way they talk about Atlantis. That's the author's own ideas, and we know it because there's no citation, and we trust that this author has been citing faithfully throughout. So properly citing your sources also ensures that you get credit for your own good ideas, and original thoughts and whatever you're drawing from your own personal experience, and knowledge, um, etc. And then here we've got, until that incontrovertible evidence is found, however, the debate will continue and the skeptics are clearly winning. Quote, what we need to find is a relic that's undeniable, says explorer John Blashford Snell. Artifacts, metals, pictographs. That's a quote. Obviously, a quote came from a source, so we have that source credited at the end of that sentence. Author's last name, page number. So far, rather than any factual evidence, believers in Atlantis have only problematic theories, and like all those who remain optimistic despite the odds, unflagging hope. This doesn't stop Atlantis from retaining its place in modern culture. Rather, the legend remains deeply entrenched in our imaginations as it has for thousands of years. Again, no citation. We know this came from the author of this particular essay. Nor are those searching for Atlantis likely to give up their quote anytime or their quest anytime soon. Says Blashford Snell, the explorer. If we don't look, we don't find. That's a quote. It clearly came from a source. Author's last name, page number, and then the final thought of the paper, to be human is to look, is the author's own idea, basically tying this all together to say, hey, believing in something like Atlantis, believing in the improbable is just part of human nature. It's part of the human condition. We are compelled to look for evidence of the unlikely. And that is sort of the author asserting their own control over the paper, that they're using these sources, this evidence that they found from various articles, etc., to support their own voice and their own ideas and their own overall argument. And that's the goal with any research paper, that it's supporting your voice and ideas and not just supplanting or replacing them. And a properly cited paper helps the reader tell, hey, what came from your sources, what comes from you, and who's in charge here. And you always want to make sure you're in charge here and your sources are backing you up, and helping your reader better understand what you're trying to say. And all of that comes down to, again, those three golden rules. If it didn't come out of your own head, such as a quote, but it's not always a quote. For example, this sentence here, there is no quote, but the information, frequency of war, devastating earthquakes occurring in Plato's own time, making it likely that Plato wove current events into a literary fabrication. That's super specific. The author didn't come up with that. They got that from their research, and we credit that research via an in-text citation. Author's last name, page number. Here's an interesting one because it looks like our in-text citation is incomplete, but it really isn't, because if you look at the whole sentence, we've got, quote, myths are stories that express meaning, morality, or motivation. Whether they are true or not is irrelevant, says author and publisher Michael Shermer. But because we live in an age of science, we have a preoccupation with corroborating our myths. In this case, we don't have to put the author's last name in that citation because we've already directly credited him in the sentence itself. So if we put Shermer again here, it's unnecessary because we already said Shermer. We put it in the sentence. So all that's left for the in-text citation at the end of the sentence is the page number. If this were not a paginated source, such as an internet article, then we wouldn't have any in-text citation. But it's okay because what would have gone in that in-text citation, which is the author's last name, is already in the sentence. Versus this sentence, where we've got, Plato was very fond of using parables to make a point, saying, quote, we may liken the false to the true for the purposes of moral instruction. Well, we didn't credit the author anywhere in that sentence, so we have to credit the author in the in-text citation. Author's last name, page number. Sometimes our citations look a little different. In this case, we don't have an author and we don't have a page number, so our citation just says the first part of the article title, as much of the title as we need to differentiate it from any other source in our works cited list that doesn't have an author and begins with the word scientist. In this case, we don't have any others. There's just the one scientist. So that's all we have to put in our in-text citation. Here we have another one. We do have an author, Rincon, but it's not a paginated source, so our in-text citation only says Rincon. Here's one, no author, so we start with the title and just enough that we need to differentiate it from any other source, and the page number. Same thing here, title, partial title, page number. Author's last name, page number. Partial article title, page number. Author's last name, page number. Partial article title, no page number, because there just weren't any. So the takeaways here are, any sentence that contains information, whether it's quoted or whether you put it in your own words that you got from a source, must have an MLA style, sorry, my cats are running around, must have an MLA style in-text citation at the end of that sentence. Sometimes if you have two or at most three sentences in a row that all contain information from the same source, then you can just put the in-text citation at the end of that second or third sentence. You don't have to repeat it for each sentence. If you have a direct quote, an in-text citation should pretty much always directly follow the direct quote. And if you have, say, 6 sentences all from the same source, I would still put the citation after the third sentence and after the sixth sentence just to make that clear. And frankly, for a synthesis essay, your whole goal is to be weaving your sources and your own voice and ideas together. So if an entire paragraph or a huge chunk of a paragraph all come from one source, that's not synthesis. That's just summary. So it's probably a bad sign if you have 6, 7 sentences, an entire paragraph, all from just one source, because it means you're not weaving sources and voices and ideas together. So, like, for example, if we look at this paragraph, we've got This is the story that captured the human imagination and continues to spark controversy today. Unfortunately, a few immediate problems arise with Plato's account. For one thing, Plato locates the island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, possibly near the juncture of the Mediterranean and Atlantic Oceans around the Strait of Gibraltar. However, an island as large as the one Plato describes could not likely have fit in this area, nor is there any evidence of one ever having been there. So, this information is 2 sentences worth, paraphrased from the source titled Atlantis. For another, though it is possible for a large land mass to have been flooded during this time period, the Upper Paleolithic period, due to the melting of the ice sheets at the end of the Ice Age, it is unlikely to have happened in, quote, a single day and night. That information, including the quote, came from the source Christopher. Then we've got, besides, Plato attributes the destruction of Atlantis to an earthquake, not to rising sea levels, though defenders of Atlantis argue that Plato may have added the earthquake for dramatic effect. Got that from the source called Lost Continent. Furthermore, the very nature of Plato's story, handed down via hearsay, throws doubt on its veracity. Most damningly, according to modern anthropology, there simply were no advanced Athenian or Egyptian civilizations in 10,000 BC, so the assertions that the Atlanteans warred with Athens and that their story was recorded by Egyptian priests seems unlikely. Got that, again, very specific information that clearly didn't come out of my own head from Christopher. So that one body paragraph uses the author's own voice and ideas, but also uses the source Atlantis, uses the source Christopher, uses the source Lost Continent, and then uses the source Christopher again. That is synthesis. And that's what I mean when I say your body paragraphs should be organized by subtopic, not source. So you don't just want to say this source says this, and this source says that, and this source says another thing in 3 different paragraphs. That's not synthesis. Synthesis is saying, hey, this whole paragraph is going to be about the things that don't make sense in Plato's original story of Atlantis. And to tell that story or to talk about those things that don't make sense, I'm going to use Atlantis source, my own ideas, Christopher source, Lost Continent source, and Christopher source again. That's synthesis. I'm braiding together multiple sources plus my own voice and ideas to explain that particular subtopic. And as long as every time I use information from a source, whether I put it in my own words or not, I credit that source with an MLA style in-text citation that clearly corresponds with a matching works cited list entry. So Christopher 44, go down to my works cited. Hey, look, there's Christopher. That information that I used was on page 44 of this 2-page article. And if I want to read that whole article in the exact same way that my author read it, I can use this information to go find it. And that is what citation is all about. Again, different styles besides MLA will use slightly different formatting, but the spirit of citation, how and why and where you cite, stays the same. And as far as trying to figure out, oh, shoot, well, what should my in-text citation look like? What should my works cited list entry look like? You just have to be able to look that up. It's a formula. It's already published. Somebody already figured it out. You have to look it up, say, hey, how do I cite a source from a journal with an author? How do I cite a source with no author from a journal? How do I cite a source with an author from a website? You don't have to memorize all that. Please don't. You have better uses for your brain space. You just have to be able to look it up. And you can look that up, again, using the Purdue OWL. Go to their free MLA style guide and look at the kind of source that you're using, figure out what it should look like in your works cited list. And then once you know that, you can figure out what your in-text citation should look like, because it's always what comes first in your works cited list. Usually the author's last name, Benetatos, Caesar, Christopher, Kuhn. But if there is no author, it's going to be the title of the article. The other good news is for your synthesis essay. In your synthesis essay assignment instructions, I've already listed all of the sources in proper MLA format. You don't have to figure that out. You just have to cut and paste into your own works cited list. And then once you have the works cited list, you'll know exactly what your in-text citation should look like, depending on what comes first in that works cited list entry and whether or not it has a page number. And that's it. So as you're working on your synthesis essay, just remember, if it didn't come out of your own head, include a citation at the end of the sentence. If you're using the source's exact words, use quotation marks to indicate that it's not just the information, but also the writing itself that comes from the source, and that your in-text citations and your works cited list entries should clearly correspond exactly. Again, works cited means these are the works I cited in my paper. So for each different in-text citation, there must be a clearly matching works cited list entry. And for each works cited list entry, there must be at least one clearly matching in-text citation. And if you have done those things, then you will have properly credited your sources, properly credited yourself, and avoided any hint of plagiarism. I hope this is useful. The other thing you can always do, and I strongly encourage you to do, is particularly if you're still uncertain about proper citation, proper works cited, proper formatting, before you submit your essay for a grade, send it to me. Let me look at it. I will show you exactly how to fix any problems. Or email me or call me or whatever, and I'll show you exactly what your citation should look like or exactly what your works cited should look like. The Online Writing Center and Smart Thinking can help you with this as well. So if you're new to writing with research, or you're new to MLA format, or you just want to make sure that you're not going to get dinged for citation issues, get us to look at it before you submit it. Be happy to, and we'll make sure that you've got it right, especially if you're moving on to English Comp 2, or really anything in your academic and professional careers that require using sources, to make sure that you always properly credit your sources for what's known as their intellectual property, something that they came up with that belongs to them. And in the same way that you wouldn't hopefully steal their car or their radio or their PlayStation, you also can't steal their ideas, and certainly not their words themselves. You have to credit them and say, hey, this came from this source. And that's the whole point of citation. And citations and works cited work together to make sure that your reader can go find the exact same source that you looked at. And if I can help, please don't hesitate to contact me. And I can't wait to read your papers.